Я хотела бы открыть дискуссию относительно этих двух докладов и вопросы к участникам. Да, пожалуйста. Только, да.
Я хотела бы спросить о том, что в Молдове, еще там в каких-то странах большая доля ВВП составляется денежными переводами. Влияет ли это на реальный курс их валют? Повышается ли он? Определяет ли это какие-то еще, например, масштабы монетарных изменений, монетарной политики прежде всего? Их правительство как-то это используют? Спасибо.
Я думаю, это вопрос для Российской Федерации, да? Или Молдавии? Okay. Okay, thanks for the question. As I hopefully demonstrated, there are two different components on remittances channels on Moldova. One is the Russian one, the other one is the European Union one, right? So by definition, Russia's stresses would affect only the Russian component of the remittances in Moldova, which are around 60%, and this is a declining trend, as a matter of fact. The type of policies that one can, in general, use to reduce external vulnerabilities, they depend on the type of exposure. Moldova also happens to have a exposure via the trade channel, and one of the ways for you to reduce that, of course, is to diversify your trade composition, both in terms of products and in terms of markets. Moldova is one of the countries that has signed an association agreement with the European Union during the course of this year, one of the three, as a matter of fact. The implication of that is that, first, likely the trade flows of Moldova will continue to diversify towards the European Union, which is a market that, even with low growth rates, actually has returned to growth. And because of the measures on the association agreement with the European Union, we are going to have support for both the composition diversification of the exports of Moldova, which is another type of supportive component. Also, if you think of this as a progress of progressive alignment with the European Union, this will also strengthen the process of diversification of migration flows out of Moldova towards European Union markets.
Юрий Зисер, Дубай. Спасибо за очень интересный доклад, интересную модель. Но в ней есть, на мой взгляд, один существенный методологический недостаток, потому что не учитывается импорт. И таким образом, не учитывается структура экспорта. В частности, наш экспорт на Запад в значительной степени связан с реэкспортом российской нефти. И если мы добавим в модель этот фактор, то зависимость белорусской экономики от российской окажется на глаз раза в 1,5 выше. Спасибо.
Спасибо за вопрос, это правда. As I indicated myself on the slides, what we do for the CIS countries is a naive, quote-unquote, estimation. Simply because our modeling tools, for, I think, obvious reasons, tend to be much more sophisticated for advanced European Union economies. For the modelization that we did for the European Union, we did take into account all sorts of second-round effects and also the composition of both imports and exports, including the exposures in the energy sector. So the results, therefore, are much more theoretically grounded. What we did for CIS countries was not a model per se, and therefore the results have all the weaknesses that we can expect from this sort of a situation. But I do recognize the point that you made, which is a correct and very good one.
My question is about different regions. Did you have a chance to estimate? Окей, хорошо, когда я буду говорить. Вопрос такой. Пробовали ли вы оценить по схожей методологии зависимость балтийских государств от экономики России и от экономики стран СНГ в целом?
Sure, спасибо за вопрос. You are correct that economic relations are always a two-way street, right? So you should have a effect that goes from a reduction in growth in Belarus that would affect to a degree the Russian Federation. Again, on the modelization that we did for the European Union, we take into account the two-way effect. So you have a GDP shock that affects the European Union, which also feeds into the Russian Federation. We didn't do that for the CIS, but I should point out here that the likely effects of that are going to be much, much smaller than in the case of the European Union-Russia relation because of the relative size of the two economic areas. The European Union is several times larger than the economy of the Russian Federation, and it's the largest economic market of Russia. So if you have a reduction of growth in the European Union, this by definition feeds into Russia. The CIS as an economic bloc is clearly dominated by Russia in terms of GDP. Russia is a full close to 80% of the economic weight of the CIS, depending on the way that you measure that. All the other guys are just 20%. Belarus is going to be a fraction of this 20%. Implication of that is the following. The effects from a GDP shock from Belarus into the Russian economy are going to be, in all likelihood, very small, right? In other terms, this will probably not affect the overall results that we have all that much, because this feedback channel from the CIS countries to the Russian is, in all likelihood, quite small.
Круг Дмитрий Пирог. У меня также вопрос к господину де Соуза. Вы отметили, на мой взгляд, очень важную проблему снижения потенциала роста во всем регионе СНГ, то, что вы назвали структурными факторами. А какое объяснение, какие основные причины, на ваш взгляд, стоят за снижением потенциала роста в регионе СНГ?
Thanks again for the question. Is indicated on the presentation itself, there are a few common structural factors that are global. If you look at global trend growth, we all actually have a tendency to grow less. One of the reasons for this is because, sadly, we are all getting older, right? And our populations are shrinking. Okay, so from some points of view, this probably is a positive development, right? The implication of that is that one of the production factors, we are production factors, right? We workers, right? We all work, so we produce the stuff in an economy. As an economy gets older and its population starts shrinking, almost by definition, its growth capacity reduces. The question in Europe and the question for the CIS is that this tendency to aging is much more pronounced among CIS countries than in other regions of the world. There are very few countries on the world that have the sort of aging profile we have here. I believe that actually Korea is one of those, and Japan, which has the pole position here. So there are common factors. One of these is related to aging and population shrinking. Now, there are other things which are more specific of the CIS region. One of them is infrastructure constraints. For those of you that have the pleasure of frequently using the Moscow metro, you probably understand what I mean by infrastructure constraints. And I don't suggest that you try to drive to Kaluga, then you really know what is an infrastructure constraint in Russia. And there are other things related to investment climate which are more common across the region. So you can think of this in those three components. One which is the endowment of physical capital, infrastructure. One which is the endowment of human capital, aging and populational reduction. And another, the endowment of institutional capital, so investment climate. All of those things are important for the CIS region and its growth slowdown.
Профессор Кочаровский и Международный и некоммерческий фонд «Это новая экономика» и это Краков. Скажите, пожалуйста, когда вы оценивали этот сценарий по это влияние на Европу, учитывался ли такой фактор, как это невозврат, это финансовых, это кредитов для западных банков? Или только учитывался это газовый фактор? Потому что у нас в Европе там очень сильные оценки по поводу такой это позиции России. И там очень, это больше, чем 1%, который вы в одном сценарии указали.
Так, спасибо за вопрос. Да. We were capable, because the modeling tools that we had for the European Union were much more robust and detailed, to fully specify our Russia shock. So we not only we had a trade shock, not only we had an energy shock, which we model in physical and price terms, so an actual interruption of energy supply, more specifically the share of gas that flows via Ukraine, with not only a quantitative effect but with a price effect too. We fully specified a financial shock. What we did was the following. We went via each individual member state of the European Union. We calculated what was the exposure that they had in terms of banking assets in the Russian Federation, and we individually modeled that as a shock that came out of financial flows from Russia into the European Union. More than that, as I indicated before, we also modeled a expectational shock on the top of all these three real shocks. So the trade shock, the financial channel shock, the energy shock. We model a fourth one, which was an expectational one. What we did was the following. We used it as a benchmark what we call the Lehman shock, so the closure of Lehman Brothers in the United States, which was the trigger for the global crisis, that had an expectational effect in terms of market risk aversion in the European Union. So we modeled the expectational shock as 1/4 of a Lehman shock. So it was a fully specified model with 4 different channels, 3 of them real, financial, trade, and energy, plus an expectational component to it. Again, that's only for the European Union, because that's where we had the models that enable us to be that detailed.
Я хотела бы поблагодарить участников за очень интересные вопросы и докладчиков за очень интересные доклады. К сожалению, мы вынуждены закрыть панельную часть нашей конференции, панельное выступление, панельную